Hi. Over a century of accumulating evidence from epigenetics, neuroscience, transpersonal psychology, psychoanalysis, quantum physics has established the prenatal and preconceptional period as the most formative phase of human life. Yet, our collective response remains startlingly narrow. Maternal antenatal programs dominate the landscape. Fathers remain peripheral, and the baby as a sentient being, despite the pioneering work of so many pioneers in the prenatal psychology, who recognized and documented the consciousness of the prenate before the wider world was ready to hear it. This knowledge, this understanding is still largely absent from professional discourse. Professional turf conflicts consume energy that could save and serve life. And meanwhile, laboratory science races ahead with artificial wombs, pregnancy robots, genetic engineering, extraterrestrial travel, while our planet faces unprecedented ecological and humanitarian crises. This talk proposes a paradigm expansion from prenatal education to planetary education. Drawing on physics pioneers, the philosophy of Jim Jebser, indigenous wisdom traditions, and the urgent need to interrupt transgenerational trauma transmission, it calls for a courageous, integrated, and cosmically aware approach to human beginnings, one that recognizes that newly conceived life is a localized excitation of cosmic consciousness, and that every parent is a gatekeeper of planetary and cosmic heritage. The prenatal and perinatal period is not a passive waiting room. It is the most dynamically formative phase of human existence, one whose imprints reach across the entire lifespan and across generations. What do we know from different disciplines? From neuroscience, for example, we know that the fetal brain begins forming neural connections as early as the 7th week of gestation. And by the 3rd trimester, the fetus demonstrates sensory processing, memory formation, and responsiveness to maternal emotional states. Research by Gluckman and Hansen, and they are not the only ones, established the concept of developmental programming. Early environmental signals such as nutritional, hormonal, emotional, toxic calibrate the developing organism's physiology, setting trajectories for cardiovascular health, metabolic function, stress reactivity, and cognitive capacity that persist throughout life. The Barker hypothesis, now developed into the broader field of developmental origins of health and disease, demonstrated that conditions in the womb predict the patterns of adult disease, including diabetes, cardiovascular disease, cancer, and mental health disorders. Epigenetic research has transformed our understanding of inheritance. Landmark studies, including work on the Dutch hunger winter cohort, Leningrad siege, the ice storm in Quebec project, and research on the descendants of the Holocaust Holocaust survivors, demonstrate that environmental and psychological stress during gestation produces heritable epigenetic marks that alter gene expression not only in the child but in subsequent generations. And of course, Michael Minnie's work on maternal care showed that the quality of early bonding modifies the HPA axis, stress response system, at the epigenetic level with lifelong and potentially transgenerational consequences. We are not merely passing on DNA, we are passing on the epigenetic memory of our emotional and environmental experience. The recognition of the prenate as a conscious, sentient, emotionally responsive being did not arrive easily or quickly in the professional world. There were a lot of pioneers in the field since the 1920s. Their foundational contribution cannot be overstated. They changed the question from when does the baby become conscious to how could we ever have assumed that it was not. All of these pioneers working across clinical, therapeutic, and research domains established through decades of evidence that prenatal experience is not merely physiological. The baby in gestation is a being carrying their own identity, their own sensitivities, their own ways of meeting the world, and the relational field they inhabit during gestation shapes the architecture of their psychological, of course, physiological life for decades to come. And the recent microbiome research reveals that the colonization of the infant gut, beginning in utero and critically shaped by the birth mode, maternal microbiome, and early feeding, programs immune function, inflammatory responses, and mood and cognition through the gut-brain axis. The concept of the social womb extends this. The mother's relational and emotional environment shapes hormonal milieu, vagal tone, and the neurochemical bath in which the prenate develops. Oxytocin, cortisol, serotonin, and catecholamines cross the placenta, acting as chemical messengers from the social and emotional world to the developing brain. Equally significant is the preconception period, the oocyte that will become the child was itself formed in the maternal grandmother's womb, meaning 3 generations are biologically present at once. And sperm epigenetics carry paternal stress and environmental exposures that the father carries. Research on preconception, nutrition, toxic load, psychological preparation, and relational security demonstrates that the quality of the preconceptional environment is a primary determinant of pregnancy outcomes, child development, and long-term health. The World Health Organization and major obstetric bodies have increasingly endorsed preconception care as a global health priority. But where are we now? Over the past several decades, prenatal education has grown into a recognizable field. Antenatal classes, childbirth preparation programs, parenting education have become standard in many healthcare systems. Prenatal attachment services have shown measurable effects on maternal sensitivity and infant outcomes. Specialist approaches such as My Program Welcome, bonding analysis, Generafy, and Georgi Haidas, later developed by Gerhard Schroth and Ludwig Janos, whole self pre-birth psychology, all of them offer structured frameworks for engaging with the baby as a conscious participant in their own welcoming to life, working not only with cognition and behavior, but with the deeper emotional, somatic, and transpersonal dimensions of the prenatal relationship. Despite compelling evidence, though, that the paternal stress, mental health, relational quality, and active engagement during pregnancy significantly affect not only the maternal well-being and through that the infant outcomes, but the evolutionary activation of what could manifest in the child's whole life. However, fathers remain conspicuously marginalized in prenatal education and care, and most antenatal programs are designed and are designed for mothers, delivered to mothers, and fathers attend when they attend at all as secondary participants, supporters rather than beings with their own developmental journey, their own unresolved prenatal and perinatal histories, and their own critical role in the relational field that surrounds the developing child. Emerging research on paternal prenatal bonding, including neurobiological changes in expectant fathers, such as hormonal shifts in testosterone, oxytocin, prolactin, and cortisol, and the influence of paternal emotional availability on the prenate and on the infant development, compels us to build the programs in which fathers are full participants, not just the helpful bystanders. Perhaps the most profound gap in current prenatal practice is the near complete absence of the baby as a recognized participant. Prenatal programs focus on parents, their knowledge, their experience, their well-being, their preparation. The baby in gestation is addressed as an object of care rather than as a being with their own sentient life, their own responses, their own need to be welcomed and met as beings. And this absence reproduces at the collective level precisely the relational failure that prenatal psychology has identified as a source of lifelong wounding, the experience of being present but unseen, of existing without being genuinely encountered. The field that should be united by a shared dedication to the conscious beginning of life is frequently fractured by professional rivalry, conflicts between obstetricians and midwives, between midwives and doulas, between medicalized and natural birth advocates, between this and that, consume professional energy and political capital that could be directed toward the child. These conflicts carry a real cost. The primary subject, the developing human being, remains at the margins of debates conducted primarily in the interests of professional adults. Simultaneously, Laboratory science proceeds at an accelerating pace, largely unconstrained by the wisdom of the prenatal science field. Genetic engineering, CRISPR-based germline editing, ectogenesis research, stem cell modification, and the growing possibility of gestation outside the human body are advancing without sustained engagement with what we know about the psychological, relational, and uh, consciousness dimensions of prenatal life. The prenatal field must move from margin to center, not to obstruct the scientific advance, but to insist that it occur in dialogue with the fullness of human knowledge about what life requires in its earliest formation. What is now being missed? The context in which all human births now occur is one of planetary emergency. The degradation of Earth's ecosystems, biodiversity collapse, soil depletion, ocean acidification, chemical and microplastic pollution, the weather has accelerated to a degree that exceeds the projections of a generation ago. The toxic burden accumulating in human tissues, breast milk, umbilical cord blood, and the amniotic environment means that every baby is now born into a biochemically compromised world. The prenatal environment is no longer a safe sanctuary, but a permeable interface with industrial civilization's byproducts. Since 1969, when humanity first stood on the surface of another world, we have possessed both the technical capacity and the symbolic evidence to see our planet as a whole, a living, bounded, irreplaceable home in vast and largely empty space. Yet, the decades since then have seen accelerating exploitation rather than the awakening of planetary responsibility that the view from the moon seemed to promise. To understand how we arrived at this crisis of disconnection, the work of Jean Jemser is indispensable. In the ever-present origin, Jemser traced the mutations of human consciousness through history from the archaic structure in which the human being was undifferentiated from the world, fully embedded in the living whole, through the magical and mythical structures then, and then to the mental rational structure that has dominated Western civilization for several centuries. And in its healthy expression, the mental rational structure, which gave us science, medicine, the capacity for analytical thought, is okay. But in its deficient expression, which James believed we are now living through, it became the stance of the controller, the subject standing over against the world as measurer, owner, and exploiter. This is not just an observation. It is a developmental and ecological diagnosis. The human being who understands self as separate from nature, who stands outside the living web and looks at it as a resource to be managed, is a human being in a state of profound ontological error. We are not separate from the trees. We are not separate from the soil, the water, or the atmosphere. The oxygen in our lungs was made by a plant, and the iron in our blood was forged in a dying star, and the minerals in our bones are continuous with the minerals that allow the Earth to maintain its magnetic field and its orbit. Every action against the living world is, in the most literal biological sense, an action against ourselves. Plants are not decorative. They are the oxygen infrastructure on which the animal life depends. Soil is not dirt. It is a living community of organisms whose stability and mineral complexity is the foundation on which our physical bodies are built and maintained. Water is not a commodity. It is the medium of life itself, present in every cell. To treat these as resources to be consumed at will is not merely unethical. It is a form of collective self-harm driven by a consciousness structure that has forgotten what it is. While this deficient mental irrational structure is not the end of the story, but a threshold of a new mutation, what could be called the integral structure of consciousness, a mode of awareness that recovers the embeddedness and participation of earlier structures while retaining the clarity and differentiation of the mental. This is the consciousness that planetary education is called to cultivate and transmit, beginning in the womb, where the developing human being is still neurologically and epigenetically in a state of profound permeability with the world. The preconception period and the gestational months constitute a uniquely receptive window for parents and through them the developing child, in which the orientation toward life can be shaped at its most fundamental level. The neurobiological, epigenetic, and psychological evidence supports the claim that the relational and emotional field of gestation encodes the child's basic stance toward the world. Is life safe or threatening? Is the world a place of abundance or a place of scarcity? Am I welcome here? Do I belong to something larger than myself? Bonding is a lifelong process that already starts before conception. The linking process that bridges the pre and postnatal and prepares the child to safely and meaningfully connect with the world and whatever life on earth is. To bond the child to the cosmos through conscious, loving, cosmically aware gestation is a concrete developmental act with measurable and lasting consequences for how that life is lived, what values it embodies, and what relationship it maintains with the living world. The prenatal field, of course, in its intention to walk this direction, is not starting from nothing. Several sophisticated frameworks already exist for engaging with the baby in gestation as a conscious being and for supporting parents in the deepest possible preparation for welcoming new life, including my program Welcome, bonding analysis, whole self-pre-birth psychology, the somatic work, and so many pioneer frameworks that have been developed so far. To expand prenatal work into planetary education requires a cosmological framework and understanding of the human being not merely as a biological organism shaped by the environment, but as a localized expression of a universe that has been organizing itself toward increasing complexity, evolving consciousness, connection for almost 14 billion years. The physics pioneers of the 20th and 21st centuries offer extraordinary resources for this reframing. David Bohm, for example, and his concept of the implicate order proposed that the universe is fundamentally undivided, that apparent separateness is a surface phenomenon arising from a deeper enfolded wholeness. Consciousness and matter are not separate. They are different aspects of the same underlying reality. And every human being, from the first moments of conception, is a localized unfolding of this implicate wholeness. Schrödinger, in his books, What is Life and Mind and Matter, argued that consciousness cannot be explained as a product of matter, and that the boundary of the individual self is just a construct. The felt sense of isolation and separateness that drives so much human destruction is, from this perspective, a fundamental epistemic error. Max Planck, the father of quantum theory, wrote that consciousness must be regarded as fundamental and matter as derivative from consciousness, not a machine in which minds are accidental products, but a field of consciousness in which material forms are transient expressions. And Capra, in his book The Tao of Physics and the Web of Life, demonstrated the deep convergence between modern physics and the ecological systems worldview, showing that living systems are fundamentally relational and that the mechanistic paradigm that has driven ecological destruction is not supported by the deepest findings of science. Rupert Sheldrake and the hypothesis of morphic fields and morphic resonance proposes that forms, behaviors, and even memories are transmitted across space and time through non-material fields that connect organisms to their species, heritage, and to the living systems of which they are part. And Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff and their orchestrated objective reduction theory propose that quantum processes in microtubules may be the physical substrate of consciousness, grounding awareness in the deeper structure of space-time itself. These perspectives represent rigorous thinking at the frontier of physics and biology about the nature of mind, matter, and their relationship. Integrated into prenatal work, they offer parents and children in gestation a cosmological identity, not merely a consumer of resources on a threatened planet, but a conscious expression of a universe that has been becoming for billions of years, and that now, in this particular form and body, in this particular womb, is taking another step in its own self-awareness. Before all the programs and before the frameworks, before the evidence summaries and the policy recommendations and the physics of consciousness, there is something simpler and more radical than any of them. It is the act that this entire field, at its most honest, is pointing toward, and it is the one thing that requires nothing except the willingness to pause. The most important thing we can do for the baby in gestation is not to speak. It is to listen, not to project, not to perform, not to manage, to become genuinely quiet, genuinely other-focused, genuinely receptive, to turn all attention toward the prenate, not toward ourselves, and to wait openly for what comes. What this requires is a shift that the entire Western clinical tradition has almost no framework for. Moving from the active, knowing, assessing stance of the practitioner or parent into a mode of radical receptivity directed entirely at another consciousness, not asking what the baby needs from me, not planning what I will give, but asking and genuinely not knowing the answer. Who is this being? Why is this soul coming? What does this person bring? The practice is deceptively simple. You focus 100% on the other, the prenate, setting aside the self, not forgetting the self. You enter silence, and from that silence you offer questions, not as interrogation, but as genuine invitation, as the kind of wondering that accompanies real respect for another's mystery. Who are you? Why are you coming? What are you adding as value to this world? What are your talents, your gifts? Why is this particular environment, this family, this place, this time supporting your entelechy? And then, this is the essential part, you pause, stay, remain in the receptive mode. You do not fill the silence with your own thoughts, anxieties, hopes, or interpretations. You wait, and the responses come, not as voices from outside, not as hallucinations, but as thoughts, as ideas, as images, as quiet knowings that arrive in the cleared space of genuine attention directed at another. This is how intersubjective communication works at its deepest level. In the best psychotherapy, in meditation, in the attentive listening that the indigenous elders describe when they speak of listening to the land. This practice of receptive listening is not separate from the larger project of planetary education. It is its foundation. A parent who has genuinely asked, "Who are you?" of their unborn child, and who has genuinely waited for the answer has already undergone a transformation. They have placed another being's reality at the center of their attention, and they have practiced the movement from narcissism to genuine otherness. They have experienced, however briefly, the dissolution of the assumption that they are the primary subject of the gestational story. And this same movement from self-centered to other-centered, from controlling to receptive, from knowing to wondering, is precisely what is required in our relationship with the living earth. The parent who learns to ask, "Who are you?" of the prenate is practicing the same epistemology that indigenous elders practice when they ask, "What does this land need?" It is the same consciousness that Jepser called integral, participatory, receptive, genuinely relational. It begins in the womb, it extends to the cosmos. Planetary education as proposed here is not environmental education bolted onto antenatal classes. It is a fundamental reorientation of how we understand the act of bringing new life into the world, beginning with the recognition that every conception is a cosmic event arising in a particular place on a living planet at a particular moment in the evolutionary time. This means expanding the concentric circles of body from self to parents to family to community to include the living earth and the cosmos itself. It means supporting expectant parents in developing what we might call ecological reverence and cosmic identity, the felt sense, not merely the intellectual understanding, that they and their child belong to the living web of earth and to the vast creative process of the universe. We are not different from the rest of life. We are made of the same elements as the tree, the river, the soil, the star. Separating ourselves from the living world does not free us, it amputates us from ourselves. To arrive at planetary education, we must pass through grief, not as a destination, but as a necessary threshold. And there are, if we are honest, two distinct griefs to be met, and they must be met in sequence because the second cannot be genuine without the first. And the first grief is the deepest and the least often named. It is the grief not of a loss we consciously witnessed, but of having been too blind, too shallow, too contracted in our self-concern to even register the loss as it was happening. The grief of arrogance, becoming aware of itself. The forests were falling, the species were disappearing, the soils were being depleted, the waters were being poisoned, and we did not read the signs because we had so thoroughly separated ourselves from the living world that we could no longer feel its suffering as our own. This is humiliation in its original literal sense, being brought back to the humus, the ground. It is a breaking open of the defended controlling self. The second grief, if we stop there and if we make a home in mourning, becomes paralysis. It becomes the refined despair of people who are now deeply aware of the crisis but have no pathway out of it except increasingly sophisticated lamentation. And this is the trap. To stay stagnant in grieving is to move in grief is to move nowhere, and it serves no one, least of all the children arriving now. The movement through grief leads to recognition, to seeing with newly opened eyes the extraordinary value of what was almost lost and is still, if we act, recoverable. A tree is not just a tree that you have grieved when you have grieved the forest. It is a miracle of solar energy, a community of organisms, an oxygen factory, a carbon store, a home for 10,000 species, a being with its own intelligence and its own form of communication. Soil is not dirt when you have passed through the grief of its destruction, but it is the living foundation of every civilization that has ever existed. And water is not a utility when you have wept for the rivers, but the medium of life itself, carrying the memory of rain and mountain and sea and all. From this recognition, and not from guilt, not from fear, but from love and from the expanded perception that grief makes possible, comes action, appreciation of the value of all, the end of the masterful stance, and the beginning of genuine stewardship, using planetary resources wisely, replenishing according to natural cycles, understanding ourselves as participants in a living system rather than owners of a collection of commodities. We are not the masters of the earth. We are its most recent and most capable stewards. And the most in need of remembering is what stewardship means. Every action against the living world is an action against ourselves. And every act of genuine care for the earth is an act of self-healing. But why? This is the moment to act. The children being conceived and gestated today will be the adults navigating the consequences of our collective choices in the 2060s, 2070s, 2080s, and so on. The epigenetic, psychological, and relational endowment we give them now will shape their capacity for the creativity, cooperation, empathy, and ecological wisdom the future requires. We cannot wait. Every year of delay is a generation of children arriving without the full depth of welcome they are owed. And every professional conference focused primarily on professional turf rather than on the child is a missed opportunity. And every research program that measures birth outcomes in physiological terms alone, while ignoring the psychological, relational, and cosmological dimensions of the birth field is incomplete. The time for incremental adjustment within existing paradigms is past. Now it is time for us to show courage, to advocate for planetary education, to stand in a medical or academic conference and speak about cosmic identity, indigenous wisdom, the consciousness of the unborn, the need to heal transgenerational trauma as preconditions for ecological survival, and the practice of listening in silence to an unborn child is to risk professional marginalization. The dominant culture of healthcare rewards reductionism, technological intervention, measurable short-term outcomes. To insist on a broader frame requires the willingness to be misunderstood, to be ahead of institutional consensus, to hold the vision that the evidence supports, but the culture has not yet caught up with. Those who get this message and who reflect on it honestly and who find the courage to carry it into their work are participating in what may be the most consequential developmental shift in the history of our species. The shift from the unconscious transmission of trauma and disconnection to the conscious cultivation of wholeness, belonging, and planetary responsibility, beginning at the very moment life begins. This is the work. It has never been more urgent. It has never been more possible. Thank you.